Where do you come from? I remember coming back to Canada, living in Houston, and having that question be asked of me so often, and even like till now. Are you asking about my ancestry, my history? Like, what exactly are you asking? And why exactly are you asking this racialized body this question? My name is Farihah Aliyah Shah, and I am a lens-based artist. I figured I'd take you folks a bit on a journey of my artistic practice. I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta. So if you folks can imagine Edmonton in the early or late 80s, early 90s, there wasn't a lot of diverse faces. Actually, the only people who were quite diverse were my family members. When I was about 7 years old, my family moved to Houston, Texas, and when we relocated, that's really where I was exposed to the arts and exposed to a lot of diversity. I was enrolled in the Houston Ballet Academy of the Arts, or HBA as it's called, and I got to dance alongside Lauren Anderson. She is, or was, the first African-American lead or prima ballerina within that company. So it was a really amazing experience, very eye-opening experience to see a woman of color being in a lead role. I stayed there in Houston until I was about 14. I dabbled in music, I played the violin, I started to take a lot of art-based classes, not really photography at the time, but a lot of visual arts classes. And so that was kind of the base and the starting point for me. My family moved back to Canada and we settled in Scarborough when I was about 14, so right in time for high school. And what was really cool about that experience is there was a photography class. The high school had a dark room, and that's kind of where I fell in love with photography. I really got to play with the analog process, fell in love with photography, and really wanted to pursue that as a career further. But there was someone in my life who told me that I wasn't a real artist, I wasn't a real photographer, this was just a hobby, I'm not gonna make it. And for whatever reason, I believed them and applied to other things when it came to university. I landed at York University studying human resources. I definitely was not in love with human resources. I was still pretty much in love with the arts, but I didn't know how to be a part of that world. My parents, alhamdulillah, were like super supportive. I remember as soon as I graduated, my dad looked at me and said, "So, are you gonna apply to art school, or what's the situation?" So with his blessing and encouragement, I put together my portfolio. I ended up applying to one school. I thought, if I don't make it at OCAD, then I'm not cut out to be an artist, and maybe that girl who said that I wasn't meant to be a photographer was right. But she wasn't, because I got in. I decided that I would major in photography. I had this really amazing professor who kind of opened the doors to a lot of different things for me. I remember the first assignment that I completed, and he told me that like the concept or the artist statement was extremely well written, but the execution was awful. And I appreciate his honesty. This person was super caring in his delivery, and he told me, you know, maybe the still image isn't working for you. And I was a bit crushed because, you know, I was in love with photography. What am I going to do if I can't like manipulate or use the still image? And he said, have you know, thought about using the moving image or like film? I flipped my camera to like the video mode, and I started to record instead of using the still image, and it worked so well. So that's where the concept of a lens-based artist comes from.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool.
Farihah, take 2.
I believe the first project that I completed was called Cultural Baggage, and this project was the first project that, one, I used video, two, I used a very like personal narrative. So I was exploring my history, my identity. It was a silent piece. My family is originally from South America in Guyana, and I had my grandfather's passport. It's a really large document with his photo. My parents had found it, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna use this in a project. And so I took a suitcase and I filled it with items that kind of represented myself. And I remember kind of positioning myself in front of the camera and like pulling out items from the suitcase. And for me, that suitcase represented like all the spaces that I had been, you know, moving from Edmonton to Texas and like everywhere in between. My family moved so much when I was younger and continued to move as I got older. I think I wasn't staying in a place longer than like 3 to 4 years at one point in time, and then I had stayed in Scarborough for about 5 years before moving out to Bradford and then working in Newmarket. So yeah, the significance of the suitcase was like pretty major for me. And then I had my grandfather's photo inside. I had a Quran. Nobody knew that I was like religious, which was really interesting. A lot of artists are not. I also had like gold within that suitcase, and it represented Guyana. The gold that's produced there is pretty iconic. So I spent a lot of time in my 3rd, 4th year kind of researching those types of topics, and I produced a piece called Part of a Complete Breakfast. It was a bit cheeky. I had myself like serving a breakfast on a silver platter, so speaking to the ideas of servitude and slavery. And then I overlaid found images of media. So again, this Mammy character that we see on the Aunt Jemima syrup bottle. I also played with the Rasmus character that was on a breakfast cereal that I ate quite a bit when I was in Houston, and that's cream of wheat. So I spent a lot of time in like the archive library in Toronto. I think it's on Bloor. And yeah, I was doing a lot of research on where these images came from and like the history behind these images. You start to see that I'm starting to develop this voice around culture, identity, looking at the colonial gaze or the influence or impact of colonization. And come my 4th year, this is when you get to do your thesis body of work. I remember building like a mind map of all these topics and ideas that I wanted to explore. And one of the things that I had circled was like, where do you come from? And if I give an answer of Edmonton, because that's where I was born, folks will say, okay, but where are you really from? And I say, okay, well, I did grow up in Texas. And they're like, no, but like, where are your parents from? And I'm like, okay, well, my parents are from Guyana in South America. Oh, do you speak Spanish? No, I'm not Spanish. Are you asking about my ancestry, my history? Like, what exactly are you asking? And why exactly are you asking this racialized body this question? I remember an incident in high school where if you folks like went to school in Ontario, you know that like when the anthem goes, you would have to stop to let the anthem play. And if you were like really close to the door, you would try to like nudge your way into the door, even though the anthem was playing. And I remember there was a history teacher of mine who stopped us. Again, remember folks, I went to high school in Markham. It was a super racialized like group of students, but majority of the faculty or like the teachers were white. And so she stopped us outside the hall and she was like, you know, how dare you folks, you know, move during the anthem? Your parents came here to give you a better life. And I sat here and I said, no, they didn't. My parents came here to give you a better life. My dad is a chemical engineer. What do your parents do? Like, not everybody has the same story or narrative of why they've come to a country. So yeah, those were stories that I thought of. I thought of the idea of Blackness. If you folks remember that project that I talked about, cultural baggage, part of that cultural baggage was like being able to call myself Guyanese, especially in my body. My identity was definitely questioned. I didn't really rock my curly hair when I was in high school. I had really straight hair. I used to wear hazel contacts. It's a long story, but wore hazel contacts, and so people thought I was brown. My name is also quite like East Indian. And my dad would show up to school and they were like, yeah, she's definitely not black. And so the people were very confused. And then my mom would show up to school and they were like, I guess she's mixed. So yeah, it was a bit difficult for me to identify as, you know, am I Black? Am I East Indian? Do I say that I'm Guyanese? Do I just say that I'm from Texas? Do I just say I'm from Edmonton? What do I do? So anyway, those were the things that I was kind of fleshing out when I was thinking about this thesis body of work. This is how my dad talked about his identity. When I was like 7, 8 years old, that's when we moved to Texas, and I had a friend who was Gujarati. She asked me if my family was from Gujarat, and I was like, I don't know. I'm Black. I don't know. My family's from Guyana. So I went back home and I asked my dad, and I was like, Dad, my friend told me that I'm Indian. And he's like, yeah, you are. And I was like, what? You've always told me you're a Black man. And my dad says, well, I identify as Black. And my dad is biracial, East Indian and Black. And I asked him why. And he told me a story of when he was quite young in his engineering career, living in Edmonton. He went to a conference or something to that effect in the south of the States, in Louisiana. So it must have been like mid to late 80s, somewhere around that time. And my dad told me that the rest of the folks he had studied with were all white, and he was the darkest person in the room, so he was often treated like a Black man. When he was at this conference, they would go around and give their ideas and things of that nature, and he was always called last to give his ideas. When they went out to a restaurant, he was always served last, and he noticed in this restaurant space that the waiters were always white to come and take your order, the people who served your food were the Black folks, and then the people who came and clean up were the Black folks, but the people to come pick up the tip were the white folks. So my dad paused and had conversation with one of the busboys. He said, what's the situation here? And he's like, yeah, this is life, man. This is what life is like in the South. And so my dad told me that, you know, this idea of Blackness is like a political stance. If you're not white or aligned with whiteness, then you just are default Black. And so that really sat with me for a really long time. That was kind of my idea of like race and identity. So it took a while for me to get comfortable within my skin. Just before I did thesis in 2015, like the summer of 2015, my mom and I decided to go to Spain, like the south of Spain, so we could kind of explore Islamic history. And by virtue of space, like the south of Spain is really, really close to Morocco. So my mom and I took a ferry, like with a tour group, to Morocco, like a day trip. I remember being on the bus, and the tour guide was asking us, or asking my mom rather, if she was Muslim. She's like, yes, I am Muslim. And he said, you need to give me your passport. She said, why? And he said, because you're Muslim and you need to surrender your passport. And she said, I'm Canadian. He said, it doesn't matter. You're Muslim, you need to surrender your passport. So we're still on the bus on the way to the ferry to enter Morocco. And my mom turns to me and turns back to the tour guide, and she's like, what about her? She's also Muslim. And he asked me, are you Muslim? I said, yes. And he said, yes, I'll need your passport too. My mom and I are the only like visible people of color on this bus. We're also the only Canadians, the only visible Muslims, and yeah, we have to surrender our passports. So everybody else gets off the ferry and doesn't have to go through customs. It was a really, really interesting experience. No stamping of the passport, like folks just kind of walked right through. My mom and I were walked into a little room, separate. And the passport control agent was asking us where our origin was, our last name, do we have any connections to Iran? And I was like, no, not that I know of. And I could hear my mom in the other room. They're asking her the same questions. Where did you get this name from? And my mom said, I'm married, I got it from my husband. And they asked her, what's your maiden name? And she says, Weatherspoon. And they're looking at her and she's like, yes, my last name is Weatherspoon. My husband's last name is Shah. I see that you're very confused. My family is like, we were born in Guyana, not Ghana, in South America. Like my mom is giving a history lesson in the other room, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're not gonna make it out. We're gonna be here for a long time. But anyway, so we got harassed, more or less, is the situation. So I had all these ideas in my mind, very rich kind of tactile experiences that I wanted to draw from for my thesis body of work. And what resulted in kind of a year worth of exploration was a piece that I titled Prefix. I named the piece Prefix because I thought, am I going to be known as a Black artist? Is this prefix going to follow me for the rest of my artistic career? What does that mean in the context of the world that we live in? Blackness has such a negative connotation, even if I am proud of being a Black female identified person. Again, this connotation is quite negative. How am I going to produce the work that I want to produce without being asked if it has something to do with racism, colonization, all of these things that pertain to Blackness? If I make a piece that's about land, are people going to ask me about slavery? So I did a portrait piece that did not, I guess, exemplify the ideas of portraiture, so I hid my face, which is like the anti-portrait, yeah? No markers of like facial feature perspective that folks could use to identify or try to use to identify like where I was from. You folks have to understand, in the history of photography, it is very white. I'd say the history that we learn is very Eurocentric period, but the history of photography in particular is extremely white. And when there are Black bodies or female identified bodies that are of Black origin, it's pretty derogatory, and it's looking at like fetishization, and then it's looking at, again, these like slave portraits. So that's the context that we have to go off of to reference Blackness and a Black body. And so I wanted to explore or broaden the conversation about that, add to the canon or the history of photography with my work, and talk about other ways to talk about identity and Blackness. And my voice is only one perspective and one lens. Blackness comes in so many different packages. And so yeah, this is my story and my truth. So within the project, I explored like my history. I specifically narrowed down the idea of what it meant to be Guyanese, what the colonial gaze has done in terms of like that identity. So the project had like teacups, it had stained tea bags that were like pinned on Eurocentric or European-like fabrics. And then it had gold jewelry that looked like quote-unquote Indian jewelry, yeah? Something that you would see adorned by perhaps a Hindu bride within Guyana. And the jewelry that I used was a friend of mine who is Guyanese also, and that's what she wore for her wedding. And I saw a lot of folks who, even though they were Muslim, they would, if they were East Indian, they would also kind of adorn themselves with this jewelry. So I thought I picked certain symbols that would kind of call to my heritage and my background and start a conversation. And then my hair was super curly, or it is super curly. I made sure that I focused on like the texture of my hair so people could have conversations about Blackness as well. It was so interesting to see people come in. We have this event called GradX where folks come from all over. It's open to the public, and it was interesting to hear the conversations in the room. They would ask if I was a man, because I'm bare-backed, and at the time I was very fit. Yeah, I had been in 3 car accidents and then gone through rehab, and then was able to work out again. So I was like training and lifting, so I was like super, super fit. So there were conversations around like the Black identity, femininity, conversations around identity, colonization, kind of this Eurocentric lens on your identity. All of these things were kind of happening. So yeah, that was my thesis body of work. And again, I was like really cultivating this voice. I was surrounded by some amazing folks, and I thought, okay, I got my foot in the door. I'm going to be an artist, ? After Prefix was a good run, like I started to get a lot of exhibitions. I started to notice on the roster I was the only Black artist or artist of color, period, that was being included. It was hard to speak to because a lot of the, I guess, mentors that I had, although they came from like a female perspective, they were all white, so they weren't able to really understand what I was going through or be able to support me in that. And it wasn't until I kind of expanded my artistic network and got to work with more artists of color and different backgrounds that I was like, oh my gosh, you face the same thing too, eh? And so we would have all these conversations and kind of put strategies together on how to combat these things or help each other write emails back to curators who would say really racist, harmful things. So yeah, that is the art world. That is navigating space. It is art is a microcosm of life, and so even though it's an industry that is, loose and free and all of these things, it still has all the harmful things that I was actually running away from when I was studying human resources, because people don't change really. So you have all these kind of like things throughout history that's just kind of replicating themselves throughout. It's been an interesting journey. I'm still creating with both the still image, the moving image. My practice has also moved into more installation-based works. I have the privilege to get to choose the projects that I want to work on. So it's super important for you to, even though you might need that paycheck, to say no. And to find another alternative and to reassess the community. The art community might not be the community that represents you, so perhaps you need to like make your own type of community, or you need to just find the right people that are able to support you, because like I said, those naysayers are everywhere, and they might be patting your back in one scenario, but they are definitely kind of jabbing and twisting the knife in another. And so super important, I think, as a Black creative, to identify spaces and call out those harmful spaces. Yeah, make room for there to be like learning within that, but I think the BIPOC community as a whole, we kind of get slotted as the teachers often. And so I think after the murder of George Floyd, now that things are kind of out in the open and we're having these conversations outside of our communities, it's time for folks to kind of step up and start teaching themselves, because that's how we know. So now that's how you'll know. And that's how I continue to make my work.